Nolan Cassidy stood at the precipice of a reality that defied every law of economics and logic he had ever known. Before him sprawled a majestic, 100-acre expanse of rugged ranch land, a territory he had managed to secure for the inexplicable sum of $1. The perimeter was marked by a silvered, weather-beaten wooden fence that seemed to march toward the horizon under the oppressive weight of a relentless afternoon sun. In the far distance, the primary residence crouched against the landscape like a silent, forgotten orison offered to the wilderness. The heat was a physical weight on his shoulders as he navigated the overgrown path toward the structure. When he finally reached the porch and applied pressure to the heavy front door 3 hours later, the wood groaned in a long, rhythmic protest. As the threshold gave way, Nolan realized with a jolt of adrenaline that his bargain basement acquisition included a significant detail the seller had neglected to disclose: the house was already occupied. The realization didn't come through sight, but through sound. It was a subtle, rhythmic thrumming from above, the unmistakable cadence of soft footsteps traversing the upper floor. They were deliberate, hushed, and cautious, possessing the furtive quality of someone desperately attempting to remain undetected. Nolan became a statue in the entryway, his knuckles white as he maintained a death grip on the tarnished brass handle. This structure was supposed to be a hollow shell, a vacuum of human presence. "Everything is vacant," Boone Carter had pledged, his voice raspy as they finalized the deed at the land office. He had sworn on his very soul that the property had been abandoned for an age. Yet, Nolan recalled how the man's eyes had performed a nervous dance, skittering away from direct contact. "You'll have the entire valley to yourself," he had promised. The lie disintegrated as a young woman stepped into the light at the summit of the grand wooden staircase. Her dark tresses cascaded in uninhibited waves over her shoulders, framing a face that possessed a haunting, timeless beauty. She wore a modest, utilitarian dress that bore the honorable scars of long use, faded fabric and careful mends. She did not erupt in a scream, nor did she bolt for a rear exit. Instead, she peered down at him with an expression that defied his expectations. It wasn't the wide-eyed stare of a frightened intruder, it was a look of profound, weary resignation, as if she had been mentally rehearsing this confrontation for 1,000 days. "You must be the gentleman who purchased the deed," she remarked, her voice remarkably melodic and unshaken by the intrusion. "I am Iris Quaid. I've been acting as the steward of this estate." Nolan's thoughts collided in a chaotic scramble. "Steward? On whose authority? And why was there no mention of your presence by Carter?" He scrutinized her features, his instincts honed by years of hard living, searching for the flicker of a grifter's lie. Instead, he saw a quiet, subterranean strength that mirrored the resilience he had admired in his own mother during the leanest years of his youth. "The seller didn't breathe a word about a tenant," he finally managed to articulate, his voice sounding foreign in the dusty air. Iris began her descent, each movement fluid and measured, as if she were a part of the house itself. "Boone Carter's knowledge of this ranch is superficial at best," she countered softly. "There are legacies embedded in this soil that run far deeper than any ink on a government document." She crossed the room to the window, pulling back a curtain so thin it was nearly translucent, revealing the golden sea of grassland that comprised the estate. "I have sought refuge here for 3 years. This land acted as my sanctuary when the rest of the world offered nothing but shadows. I've reinforced the roof, ensured the well remained untainted, and kept the fences from collapsing. You might say the ranch and I have entered into a pact of mutual survival." Nolan felt the meticulously constructed blueprint of his future begin to warp. He had spent 5 grueling years hoarding every cent, sacrificing comfort for the dream of true independence. This ranch, despite its state of graceful decay, was the physical manifestation of his labor. But now, sharing this stagnant air with an enigmatic stranger, he understood that his $1 investment had purchased a situation far more labyrinthine than mere acreage. Why would Carter part with it for such a pittance, he inquired, though a cold dread in his gut suggested the answer would dismantle his peace of mind. Iris turned away from the golden light, and for a fleeting second, the mask of resignation slipped to reveal a raw, jagged fear. Because, she whispered, the sound barely carrying across the room, he isn't the only individual who is aware of my residence here. There are others. And they don't come to negotiate or sign deeds. Nolan placed his battered leather satchel onto the scarred wooden table, the heavy thud punctuating the silence. His mind was a whirlwind of inquiries. The dying afternoon light slanted through the grime-streaked panes, casting elongated, skeletal shadows across Iris's features. The sheer weight of her hidden history seemed to bow her shoulders. "Who exactly is pursuing you?" he asked, forcing his tone to remain level even as his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Iris stepped away from the window, her fingers interlaced so tightly they were devoid of color. "Men who are under the delusion that I am in possession of their property," she explained. "Something of such immense value that they have spent 3 years hunting me like a beast of the field." "Did you steal it?" She locked eyes with him, and Nolan saw a clarity there that no liar could emulate. "I took what was mine," she said, her voice vibrating with the resonance of old, unhealed trauma. "It was my father's gold claim. He perished in what they called a mining accident, but before his body was even cold, these men arrived with forged debts and fraudulent papers. They stripped us of our home, our dignity, and our future." Nolan watched her, recognizing that haunted look. The expression of a soul pushed to the absolute edge of endurance. He had seen that same phantom in his own reflection during the desolate years following his wife's passing. "So, you reclaimed your heritage." "I retrieved the authentic deed and the original survey maps, documents that prove our claim was the only legitimate one," Iris said, a hint of steel returning to her tone. "Evidence that would dismantle their entire criminal enterprise if it ever reached the hands of a judge." She let out a short, cynical laugh. "But the trick is staying alive long enough to find a courthouse that isn't bought and paid for." The sudden, rhythmic thud of galloping hooves in the distance cut through their conversation like a blade. Both froze, their breath held in unison. Iris sprinted to the window, hovering behind the curtain to steal a glance at the trail. Nolan moved to her side, and together they observed 3 silhouettes approaching through the haze. They were still distant enough to be indistinct, but their purposeful gait suggested they weren't mere travelers. "Is that them?" Nolan breathed. Iris narrowed her eyes, studying the riders with a predator's focus. "No, but it's peculiar. Those mounts are being pushed too hard for a casual journey, yet they lack the frantic pace of a true emergency. It's the pace of a search party." Nolan felt a tightening in his chest. He had sought this wilderness to divest himself of complications, to exist on his own terms in a world that had taken too much from him. Yet, looking at those approaching shadows, he realized his bargain purchase had ensnared him in a web of violence far more intricate than he had imagined. "I must depart," Iris said abruptly, spinning away from the glass. "I've already stained your new home with my misfortune. You shouldn't be forced to inherit my enemies." "And where would you seek shelter?" Nolan asked. He wasn't entirely sure why the fate of this stranger mattered to him, given they had met only hours prior. She faltered, her silence speaking volumes. In that moment of hesitation, Nolan saw the bleak reality: she was at the end of her rope. There were no more sanctuaries left. The riders were closing the distance, their presence an undeniable omen of conflict. "How much time do we have before the truly dangerous ones arrive?" he asked. Iris looked back toward the horizon, then returned her gaze to him. "If those men are who I suspect they are," she said with a chilling softness, "they have already arrived." As the riders drew within 50 yards, the details of their arrival became grimly clear. These were men forged in the crucible of lawlessness, faces etched with the cruelty of those accustomed to taking whatever they desired by force. They reined in their sweating horses, maintaining a distance that allowed them to survey the house while remaining out of immediate reach of a counterattack. "That's Wade Harper," Iris whispered, her voice trembling. "He's the primary enforcer for the Maddox brothers. If he's found me, it means the hunt is nearing its end. Nolan watched with a grim fascination as the trio fanned out, creating a loose cordon that effectively neutralized any easy escape routes. Their maneuvers were synchronized and professional. These weren't aimless wanderers, they were apex predators who had finally cornered their mark. What exactly is the nature of the prize they're after? Nolan asked, needing to grasp the stakes of the impending storm. Iris moved with sudden urgency to the hearth, kneeling by a loose floorboard. With practiced ease, she pried it upward and retrieved a weather-worn leather pouch and a tightly rolled cylinder of parchment. The deed to the most lucrative gold vein in the entire territory, she said, unfurling a section of the map. My father spent a decade charting every tributary, every hidden pocket of or in those mountains. The Maddox brothers murdered him to seize it, only to realize he'd hidden the authentic records. Nolan peered at the document. The level of detail was staggering, meticulous notations and topographical measurements that spoke of a lifetime of expertise. This wasn't just a legal claim. It was a blueprint for unimaginable wealth. This is worth a king's ransom. Enough to buy the loyalty of every lawman in the state, Iris confirmed. And enough to justify hunting me across 3 borders. A sharp, piercing whistle cut through the air. Wade Harper had dismounted and was advancing toward the porch with a leisurely, predatory stride. His hand hovered near the mahogany grip of his revolver. His companions remained in their saddles, their eyes scanning the perimeter like hawks. Iris Quaid. Harper's voice boomed, carrying an artificial veneer of cordiality. We know you're lurking in there. Let's resolve this like civilized folk. Nolan felt his pulse accelerate. Years of labor as a carpenter had given him physical strength and a steady hand, but he was a man of construction, not destruction. He had never faced a professional killer. Yet, as he glanced at Iris, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with the terror of the hunted. He knew he couldn't simply cast her to the wolves. There is a concealed exit, she whispered, her words frantic. Through the larder and down toward the creek bed. You could vanish into the brush while they are preoccupied with the front. Please, save yourself. And what of you? She offered a smile that was more a ghost of a memory than a gesture of joy. I am exhausted by the running. Perhaps it is simply time to finish this. Nolan saw the defeat in her eyes. She was prepared to offer herself as a sacrifice so that he might escape the chaos his $1 purchase had invited. But as Harper's boots began to thud against the wooden steps of the porch, a countdown to violence, Nolan felt a surge of righteous indignation that eclipsed his fear. No, he stated, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. This land belongs to me now, and I don't recall issuing an invitation to these gentlemen. Nolan stepped out onto the porch, moving into the direct line of Harper's sight. The setting sun cast his shadow across the porch like a long, dark spear. He consciously steadied his breathing, ensuring his voice wouldn't betray the trembling of his heart. You're trespassing on private property, he called out, his tone firm. I suggest you and your associates move along. Harper stopped at the foot of the stairs, a cold, mirthless smile spreading across his weathered face. Well now, looks like the lady has recruited a guardian. A brave choice, friend. He took another step upward, the jingle of his spurs a metallic taunt. The thing is, we have no quarrel with you. We merely require a brief dialogue with Miss Quaid regarding some items that belong to our employer. I see no badges and no legal warrants, Nolan countered, noting how Harper's riders had shifted to cover the flanks of the house. As far as the law is concerned, everything within the boundaries of this ranch is my personal property. Harper let out a dry, raspy chuckle. Legal papers. That's rich. He gestured vaguely toward the front door. See, from our perspective, Miss Quaid has been an illegal squatter on this land for years. We suspect she may have found certain valuables that belong to the rightful owners of the Quaid interests. We're just here to facilitate a return. Inside, Nolan could hear the faint, rhythmic creak of floorboards. Iris was moving, hopefully securing the documents. He needed to be the barrier. He needed to buy her every second possible. But Harper's patience was visibly eroding. "Tell you what," Harper continued, his hand now resting firmly on the butt of his pistol. "Why don't you invite her out here? We can settle this misunderstanding with words. No need for any blood to ruin such a fine afternoon." Despite the cooling air, a bead of sweat tracked down Nolan's spine. 3 seasoned killers against one man with a hammer-swinging arm were not odds any rational person would embrace. But looking into Harper's eyes, Nolan saw the void. These men didn't care about rights or claims, they were here to erase a witness and seize a fortune. "She isn't here," Nolan lied, praying his voice sounded more convincing than the hollow feeling in his chest. Harper's face clouded over instantly. "Now that's a shame. Because my associate over there, Johnny, he has eyes like a hawk. He's quite certain he spotted 2 silhouettes in that window not 5 minutes ago." The man named Johnny tipped his hat with a mocking flourish, his rifle resting across his lap but angled for a lightning-fast draw. "Shadows can be deceptive in an old house," Nolan suggested. "The light plays tricks." "Perhaps," Harper conceded, his tone turning lethal. "Or perhaps you're providing cover for a thief who has caused my employers a significant financial deficit. Harboring a fugitive can make a man look like an accomplice. You might want to consider the company you keep." The ultimatum was hanging in the air. Harper was offering him a cowardly exit, betray the woman or share her fate. Behind him, the house had fallen into a tomb-like silence. He couldn't tell if Iris had hidden or if she was preparing for a final stand. "Time is a finite resource," Harper said, producing a gold pocket watch and checking it with theatrical precision. "And mine is running thin." The silence that followed was a physical pressure. Nolan could feel Harper's gaze dissecting him, looking for the telltale flinch of a man about to break. "I think," Harper said, snapping the watch shut, "that you bought this place specifically because of what was inside. Maybe Miss Quaid promised you a cut of the spoils." "Your theories are as worthless as your word," Nolan replied. "I bought this ranch this morning. It's the first time I've ever seen this dirt." Harper exchanged a silent, knowing look with his riders. Johnny shifted his weight in the saddle, and Nolan saw the subtle tension in the man's shoulders as he gripped his rifle. "Here is the reality of the situation," Harper announced, his voice dropping the facade of politeness. "You're going to step aside. We are going to conduct a thorough search of these premises. When we have what we came for, we'll leave. If you obstruct us, you'll be buried in the garden before the moon rises." Nolan's mouth was dry as ash, but he didn't budge. "And if I refuse to move?" Harper's smile returned, sharper than a razor. "Then we'll search it anyway, and you won't be in a position to lodge a complaint." The front door creaked open behind Nolan. His heart skipped a beat as Iris stepped out onto the porch. She had changed into rugged riding gear and carried a small, travel-worn pack. Her chin was held high, though her eyes betrayed the depth of her fear. "Enough," she commanded. "This man is a stranger to our business, Harper. Let's conclude this between the involved parties." Harper's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a trapper seeing the spring snap shut. "There's the pragmatism I expected. Come down here, Miss Quaid, and we can discuss the terms of your surrender." "The terms are non-negotiable," Iris said, standing shoulder to shoulder with Nolan. "You allow this man to walk away unharmed, and I will accompany you without resistance. My cooperation for his life." Nolan turned to her, his voice a low hiss. "You don't have to do this." "I do," she whispered back. "You've already risked more for a stranger than anyone in my life." Harper clapped his hands, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet air. "See? This is much more efficient. Now, let's discuss those documents." "What documents?" Iris asked, her voice a model of feigned ignorance. The ones that validate our employer's rightful ownership of the Quaid mine, Harper said with exaggerated patience. The papers your father secreted away before his tragic accident. My father was murdered by your employer's criminal negligence and greed, Iris spat back, her composure fracturing. There were no documents. Harper's mask of civility finally shattered. Don't test me, girl. We know you have them. We know they're in that house. The only variable is whether we find them in the wreckage of this building or if you hand them over. Iris held his gaze, but Nolan saw her hands begin to tremble. The map and the deed were her only shields, and she was about to be stripped of them. Then, a new sound began to vibrate through the valley, the thunder of multiple horses approaching from the east, riding at a breakneck pace. Harper spun around, his hand flying to his holster. A massive cloud of dust rose against the twilight sky. Johnny! Harper barked. Report. The scout squinted into the setting sun. 5 riders. Maybe more. They're pushing those animals to the limit. Harper's jaw set in a hard line. This wasn't part of the plan. He turned back to Iris, his desperation showing. New terms. We're taking you and the papers now, before this situation dissolves into further complication. I have nothing to give you, Iris insisted. Search the house. Harper roared to his men. Level it if you have to. Nolan stepped down a stair, blocking the path. You aren't setting foot inside. Harper's revolver cleared leather in a blur. The cold, oily barrel was pressed firmly against Nolan's temple. The scent of gun grease and sweat was overwhelming. This is your final opportunity to be intelligent, Harper hissed. Step aside, or I'll end you right here. The approaching riders were close enough now to be more than just shapes. They were riding in a disciplined, military-style formation. They weren't drifters, they were a force. Wade Harper. The shout originated from the lead rider, who was still a few hundred yards out but closing fast. Harper's eyes widened, and for the first time, Nolan saw a flicker of genuine alarm in the man's expression. Damn, Harper muttered. Acquaintances of yours? Iris asked, her voice laced with hope. Sheriff Bennett, Harper growled through clenched teeth. Someone must have tipped him off. He looked at his companions, who were shifting uneasily, their confidence evaporating as they realized they were now the ones being hunted. The riders thundered into the yard, the sunlight catching the silver glint of law enforcement badges. Sheriff Bennett was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of the very mountains they stood upon, lean, weathered, and possessing an aura of unshakable authority. Drop the hardware. Bennett commanded, his men fanning out to encircle Harper's group. There's no need for a funeral today. Harper didn't lower his gun, instead, he pressed it harder against Nolan's skull. That's entirely dependent on whether you're willing to let the law do its job, Sheriff. The law? Bennett laughed, a sound like grinding stones. Is that what we're calling the harassment of a woman whose family you destroyed? She's a thief harboring stolen assets, Harper shouted back. We're here on a legitimate recovery mission for the Maddox interests. The Maddox brothers' interests, Bennett corrected with visceral disgust. I've seen enough of their brand of recovery to know it's just robbery with a fancy name. The atmosphere was electric, a single spark away from a massacre. Harper's men were outnumbered, but the gun at Nolan's head was a powerful deterrent. Here is the deal, Harper announced. Miss Quaid and I are going to have a private session to locate those papers. Anyone who moves an inch will watch this ranch owner's brains decorate his new porch. Sheriff Bennett raised a hand, signaling his deputies to hold. The standoff was a taut wire, everyone waiting for the snap. Harper, the sheriff said with calculated calmness. You're digging a hole you won't climb out of. The Maddox brothers don't run this territory, and they sure as hell don't run me. Maybe not, Harper replied, his eyes darting between Bennett and Nolan. But they have enough influence to make your life a misery if you obstruct their business. Iris stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. Stop it. You want the documents? They are hidden beneath the floorboard by the hearth, wrapped in oilcloth. Take them and leave him alone. Nolan felt a pang of despair. She was surrendering her only weapon to save him. Harper's eyes flashed with greed. Johnny, get in there. And be meticulous. The rider started to dismount, but Bennett's voice stopped him like a physical barrier. I wouldn't advise that. See, Johnny, I've got a warrant here for Wade Harper's arrest on counts of murder, grand larceny, and conspiracy. Anyone who assists him is going to find themselves sharing a cell. Johnny froze, his foot still in the stirrup. You didn't mention anything about murder, Wade. Shut your mouth and get the papers. Harper screamed. But the cracks in his armor were widening. The murder of Thomas Quaid, Bennett continued. It seems we've located a witness who saw you and the Maddoxes rigging the supports in that mine. A man named Pete Harden. He's been living in fear for 3 years, but he's finally decided to speak. The revelation was a physical blow. Iris gasped, her hands flying to her face. Someone saw. Old Pete was working a claim nearby, Bennett confirmed. He saw Harper and his crew tampering with the beams right before your father went down for his shift. Harper's face was a mask of pale fury. A drunk's word won't hold up in court. Perhaps not on its own, Bennett agreed. But when combined with the documents Miss Quaid has, the ones that prove the forgery and the true ownership of that mine, it's more than enough for a hanging. Nolan felt the gun barrel at his head begin to vibrate. Harper was realizing that the walls were closing in. Killing Nolan wouldn't save him anymore, it would only hasten his end. Johnny. Get the papers. But Johnny was already backing his horse away, hands raised. I'm not swinging for you, Wade. I'm out. The third rider didn't even say a word, he simply wheeled his horse and vanished into the timberline at a full gallop. Harper was suddenly alone, standing on a porch that wasn't his, facing a murder charge. His breathing was ragged, the sound of a man who had run out of road. This isn't the end, Harper whispered. The Maddox brothers will never stop. Those papers are worth too much. Maybe, Bennett said, dismounting and drawing his own weapon. But that's a problem for a different day. Right now, the problem is that gun. Put it down. Harper's hand shook violently. Nolan realized with a terrifying clarity that the man was about to do something suicidal. In a final, desperate act of malice, Harper snarled and swung his weapon toward the sheriff. Nolan didn't think, he reacted. He threw his weight against Harper, shoving him backward as the first shot erupted. The world dissolved into a cacophony of gunfire and smoke. Nolan tumbled off the porch, hitting the dirt hard. The deputies fired with clinical accuracy. 2 rounds struck Harper in the chest, and the outlaw collapsed, his body going limp before he even hit the floorboards. Silence returned to the valley, heavy and thick with the scent of cordite. Is everyone accounted for? Bennett called out. Nolan pushed himself up from the dirt, his ribs aching but otherwise intact. Iris was already at his side, her face a mask of concern. Are you hurt? I've had worse falls, he grunted, looking at Harper's body. Is he gone? A deputy nodded. He won't be bothering anyone else. Sheriff Bennett holstered his weapon and approached Iris. Miss Quaid, I am profoundly sorry for the delay in justice. If you're willing to provide your testimony and those documents, we can finally dismantle the Maddox operation for good. Iris nodded, her eyes glistening with tears of relief. I have been waiting for this moment for 3 years. The evidence is inside. Everything my father recorded, including the proof of the forgery. 2 hours later, as the purple hues of twilight deepened into night, the sheriff and his men prepared to depart. They had secured the evidence and the body of Wade Harper, promising to return within the week to escort Iris to the territorial capital. Nolan and Iris stood on the porch, watching the lanterns of the lawmen fade into the distance. The silence was no longer heavy with dread, it was light, filled with the promise of a new beginning. "So," Nolan said, leaning against the railing. "I imagine you'll be heading to the city once this is all over." Iris looked out over the dark expanse of the ranch. "And where would I go? I've spent 3 years pouring my soul into this dirt. It seems a shame to walk away now." "It's technically my property," Nolan reminded her, though there was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. "True," she said with a soft laugh. "But you bought it for $1, and it came with a resident expert. Besides, 100 acres is a lot of ground for one person to cover." Nolan thought about the 5 years of isolation he had endured to reach this point. He had imagined this ranch as a fortress of solitude. But looking at Iris, he realized that the best structures aren't built of wood and stone, but of shared burdens and common goals. "Partners?" he asked, extending a hand. Iris took it, her grip firm and certain. "Partners." As the first stars began to pierce the velvet sky, they walked together into the house, the $1 ranch that had turned out to be the most valuable thing Nolan Cassidy had ever owned.